Hey guys, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reading assignments that you had this week. So we're going to start with our text for Kimball and Hawkins in Chapter 10. Chapter 10 relates a lot to project management, and I want to talk a little bit about that and apply it to what I do in software development. Uh, I want to first go over the key players. So we have document designers, writers, illustrators, editors, and SMEs, which stands for subject matter experts. Now, with these roles, they can overlap, or you might actually be acting as all four of these items: the designer, the writer, the illustrator, and the editor. Or in some cases, you may not have all these people. Illustrators, we haven't had illustrators in my department before, but we definitely create our own graphics, as we also work with our usability team for user experience. They often design the icons that we need to use in our documentation, so that's another group that you might end up working with. And subject matter experts, those are usually going to be people who are working on the product that you're documenting. In my case, that would be software, and there's usually a functional designer. Sometimes they're called business analysts. Terms are going to vary company to company, but those are the most frequently used names for the roles of the people that you will need to seek out. You may also be working with developers who are actually coding the product, or you might be working with some sort of a strategy team or a marketing team that works at your company. Now, there's two main ideas for project management and software development, and the book talks about these two. I changed one of the names in the second. So first is waterfall. Kimball and Hawkins talk about this. The next is agile. They refer to that as the iterative process. I don't think that term is used as much anymore, but agile is definitely something that you'll hear come up, especially in software development. So that's the term I went with here, but just know that that's what the concept is about. So waterfall is the method that each step needs to be completed when you move to the next. So it looks like steps or waterfall. So you can kind of picture that visual. I think there's a visual actually in your textbook. If not, if you just Google it, there's a lot of visuals that you can see. So an example of when this type of project management really works is during a 6-month release cycle. So that's something where there's a longer release cycle and teams are completing each step before moving to the next. So you have almost, it might seem like you have more time to complete things because of the way the product is divided. Whereas Agile, and I'm actually going to read this definition because I borrowed it from Atlassian, which is a tool you can use for project management and a tool that, or well, a company that creates tools that you can use. They own Jira and I believe Confluence. But Agile is an iterative approach to project management and software development that helps teams deliver value to their customers faster and with fewer headaches. Instead of betting everything on a big bang launch, an agile team delivers work in small but consumable increments. Now, I'm going to expand a little bit on that so you can understand what the process is like. So, with my company, we work in 2-week sprints. So, software teams are meeting and planning what they're going to do and accomplish in those 2 weeks. So, they'll have tasks set out and broken down, and tasks are assigned different weight levels, how long they will take to complete. So one way to do that is with t-shirt sizes. So they might be evaluated by small, medium, or large. That's just one way of evaluating how much work it takes to complete something. So while they're doing that 2-week sprint, they know exactly what they're going to work on in those 2 weeks. Now, at the end of the 2 weeks, they might be saving their work in a build and continuing to work on the next product or project, but they also might just be releasing that as is. With a lot of software being on the cloud now, you don't have to always wait for an update for your clients. You can just push that update and they'll have it right away. So if there was a bug that you needed to fix and it was critical, you can push that update and have it out within 2 weeks. So what does that mean for documentation? Well, if that's something that needs to be documented in that 2 weeks, the document writer is actually working alongside that project team, or in this case, the coders, to document what they are working on as they're working on it. So that might mean documenting based on wireframes, documenting based on a build that isn't a final build or a stable build. It may not even have all the functionality. You might have to document based on what is supposed to happen. That's not abnormal to have happen in these agile environments. And I want to jump over to the next slide here because I have two diagrams of waterfall and agile, and this really illustrates what the process is like. So as I said, with waterfall, you're completing before going on to the next. So here you have your concept. Once you're done with that, you go to design. Once you're done with that, you go to develop, and then you test it. Now, with agile, you can see it's kind of going in this loop, or like iterations, like your textbook says. So you're doing the design, and then you're developing, and you're testing, and you're designing, and you're developing, and you're testing, and you're going in these iterations. So there isn't necessarily a full stop when you get to the end, because you might have feedback in between there, and you might still need to continue working. So that's more of the agile environment. I know that the concept, if it's new to you, can be a little bit confusing at first, but definitely going in and seeing that if your company uses it, it's a great way to experience it. I think it's something that you can read about, but once you experience firsthand, it's not as overwhelming as it seems. It may seem like these iterations are very short and you have to be very fast paced. That's not always the case. There are some sprints where I do not have to document anything urgent, so it can actually wait until the next time. And that's something that's going to be evaluated by the writer, probably your manager in some cases. And then you can really focus on what you need to during that sprint. If you're not documenting the new features, you might be enhancing older content, revisiting. So again, that's your own iteration. So I hope that helps clear things up a little bit. I always like to have a diagram handy to help me understand it. Now for chapter 11, I just want to go over some highlights, because they talk a lot about paper and printing, and definitely that's something that industries are moving away from. It's definitely not obsolete, but in my experience, I haven't ever worked for a company where we were printing user manuals unless they were something that we were creating on our own and just printing in our own reprographic space and using it there. We've never gone out and had something professionally published or professionally published something ourselves for a client. So we've only had internal use. But I do want to make sure that we take note of a couple things, because it is still relevant in some industries, especially if you're interested in some sort of publishing house type work. So standard paper size, I just want to make a note of that. US, it's 8.5 by 11. I always thought that was what the world used, but it's actually not the same size around the world. So for Europe, for example, they use A4, which is very close in size, but I think it's about 8.25 instead of 8.5, and then it's 11 and 15/16, I think. But commonly that'll be known as A4. Printers and companies tend to have that as a size option. They may stock that paper if you're doing work with European companies. So that's just good to know if you end up working at a company that is international or does a lot of work in Europe. You might not always have that 8.5 by 11 that you're used to, so you might be playing with margins differently or arranging layout differently. I also want to talk about linear proofreading and layered proofreading. So linear proofreading is reading through the document word for word. You're looking for grammar, spelling, copyright, anything that's libelous. Layered proofreading, on the other hand, is looking for visual consistency. So things like headers, how your images are formatted, how everything is formatted, really, and any type of front matter that you might have. And by front matter, I mean things like the table of contents or any publication information that you might have in the front. Some of our user guides have title pages, even though we're not printing them. We have PDFs available that have front matter in them. So you want to make sure that all of that is meeting your company standards. Now, I also want to touch a little bit on translatability. This wasn't something that I saw in Kimball and Hawkins. In this chapter, these two chapters, they do touch on translation, localization, globalization throughout the book, but I wanted to explain a little bit more about it just because that's one of the subject matters that I'm very familiar with. So I wanted to offer some tips here for translation if you end up working for a company that wants to translate their content and they don't want to rewrite the content. They want it written in a way that it can be easily translated into other languages. These are the types of tips that you would be looking at. So you want to avoid abbreviations unless the translator already knows how to handle that. For example, sometimes you might say app instead of application. If you really mean the full word application, then you should be writing that out. You want to also avoid American references, and the example I put here is Philadelphia, PA. We have a tendency to think of that as, oh, well, it's a big city in Pennsylvania, so yeah, people will know that. But it's not a big city compared to the rest of the world. They might be looking at New York City or Los Angeles and saying, oh, those are the big cities. Whereas Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they may have not heard of. Good examples are also to use Tokyo, Japan, or London, England. These are bigger cities that people are more likely to know if you need a geographical reference. Other things like with sports, you wouldn't make an American football reference because football with F-U-T is soccer for other countries, and that's actually a more common sport throughout the world. So that's something that you might want to use if you had to have some sort of a sporting example. You also want to avoid any type of slang that you're using. That one I think is self-explanatory, and you guys are probably already doing that. Uh, Usually you have to avoid contractions. Now, I will say that translators are getting better, especially if you're using human translators, that they can say, okay, can't is cannot, and I will translate it as cannot. If you're using a machine, it may not be picking up on contractions and it might just come back flagged as an error, and then you have to go back and forth with the human translator at that point and discuss what your options are. So in some cases, it's just easier to use cannot or do not instead of can't and don't. Definitely don't go for any really long contractions like wouldn't have. Like some people will shorten it to wouldn't have. And that's just, it's too much. If you have double contractions, that's definitely just going to result in an error. So try to avoid that as much as you can. Next, make sure you're using consistent terminology. If you're talking about zip codes, don't start using postal codes. That might result in a different translation. And also, you're not guaranteed to have the same translator for every set of documents that you're sending out. So if someone translates zip code and the next time you use postal code, that could be a different person and they might not know you meant the same thing. So definitely make sure your terminology is consistent. You also want to leave room when you're translating language for vertical and also horizontal spacing. So, for example, German is going to need 30% plus 2 characters expansion. So it's going to be much bigger than the English version. And if you look at something like Chinese characters, those are actually vertically taller than what you see in English. So for those, you're going to need more vertical height. This is especially true in any mobile apps. You know how small the screen space is, so you have to consider what are you even going to name your app that's going to show up on the screen nicely. And just for an example, I put here the word edit. So I'm going to butcher this, but I have the German word next to it, bear beat Byton? I don't know. But you can see how many more characters it is. At first we had 4 and now we're up to 10. So that's a very large expansion. If you were just expecting that to be a short menu option, now it's a lot longer. And I know I butchered the German, but the next one would be editar for Spanish, and that's even still bigger. Again, we went from 4 characters to 6 characters. So you can see the kind of impact that something is going to have when you translate from English to another language. So even when you're